Our Methow Home, the McKinney area, a history lesson. This is the first in a series of presentations about the first communities of the Methow Valley. It's provided by the Shaver Historical Museum and narrated by Sharon Sumter. This presentation was first made in the McKinney area in September 2019 at Brown's Farm Barn. And this history lesson is possible thanks to the generous support of the Methow Valley donors to the 2018 Give Methow campaign, which was directed at using keywords to link all the various records that the museum has. This story is possible because of the Shafers collecting and preserving history for over 75 years, and for the past 16 years of archiving and documenting photos, family stories, maps, letters, and documents so we can search our database and bring stories like this to you. We're also grateful for Doug Devon's book, Mazama, The Past 125 Years, and from the donated collections of many pioneer descendants. The McKinney area is between Mazama and Winthrop, 9 miles west of Winthrop on Highway 20. It is bounded on the north by Highway 20, and on the south and the west by Lucky Jim Bluff, and to the east by the Methow River. The main north-south roads through this area are Wolf Creek Road and Cum Road. The human history of our valley is a series of 4 overlapping waves of inhabitants: the Methow tribe, fur traders, miners, and the settlers. The Methow tribe were the first inhabitants in the valley and have lived here for over 10,000 years. They were originally permanent settlers here and spent winters and summers. But once they had access and were using horses, they became nomadic, and they wintered on the Columbia River and the lower parts of the Methow River, where it was a more temperate winter. They spent 8 to 9 months in the valley harvesting roots, berries, plants, fish, and game. Pit houses were the natives' summer home, and they were discovered near Early Winter's Campground, which is west of Mazama, at the confluence of Wolf Creek and the Methow River, which is about 3 miles west of Winthrop, and at other sites down the valley where creeks dumped into the Methow River. One of the favorite summer locations for the natives when they came into the Methow Valley was alongside the Methow River at Twisp. And here you can see their teepees along the riverside, and in the background you can see a barn and some buildings of the settlers. Before the upper Methow Valley could be open for settlement, the government had to move the tribe onto a reservation in north central Washington, which finally was called the Colville Reservation, and this started in 1883. This would allow the release of the valley floor for private ownership. Although many Methow natives did move to the reservation, a few were able to take allotments along Highway 153 between Methow and Pateros. Nevertheless, many Methow members continue to spend the warm periods in this valley, often befriending, visiting, and sharing with settlers beyond the 1940s. The first white men into the Methow Valley were fur trappers from the Pacific Fur Company, based in Fort Okanagan and owned by John Jacob Astor. Other fur companies were the Northwest Fur Company and the Hudson's Bay Company out of Canada. Fur trapping was an active commercial activity from 1811 to 1846. Many early settlers trapped animals during the winter to supplant their livelihood when they weren't working on the land. From the Mazama area, this is Lydia Lyons Blevins in the 1930s with a harvest from the family's trap lines. The pelts are marten, and this is every woman's favorite photo in our collection. The next arrival was in the 1860s, and these were miners who arrived in the Pacific Northwest on their way to Alaska. Gold was discovered in Okanogan County in the early 1880s. And this is a picture of the Methow Trading Company's store up at Harts Pass, next to the Barron mine. There were hundreds of claims in Okanogan County, mainly in the northern half of the county, and many miners, single men for the most part, lived in very crude cabins and worked at the mines. This is the New Light mine at Slate Creek, which is part of Harts Pass area. And this mine was in operation in the 1930s, so it's later than the previous pictures I've shown you. There were a number of mines up there. At the high point, there were probably 2,000 people living there and mining on various claims. This is a mining depot or a store from the Methow Valley Trading Company store at Robinson Creek. Robinson Creek is just to the west of Mazama at the base of the hill that goes up to Harts Pass. The Chancellor Mine is another mine in the Harts Pass area, and mining camps usually had bunkhouses or boarding areas, and meals were provided to the miners. They worked long shifts, and normally from spring to fall. Some mines did operate during the wintertime. As I said, most miners lived up at the mines in bunkhouses, but some built cabins on the valley floor and worked during the summer and then wintered in their cabin. And these were usually men who had wives or who wanted to own land eventually. This is a picture of Ed Cagle and his wife, and Ed has featured in many of the family collections in the Mazama area. He's a very distinctive looking man, and he's easy to spot in any photo that he's in. The last group to arrive were homesteaders. In the upper Methow Valley, the second stage of opening the western lands for settlement was to free them up from their Forest Service designation. The Forest Reserve, which was the precursor of the U.S. Forest Service, released the valley floor to private ownership in the early 1890s. The upper Methow Valley was surveyed in 1895, and that same year, homestead claims were being accepted at the Waterville Land Office. This is the 1895 U.S. survey map for Township 35, Range 20, which is the area that the McKinney neighborhood is in. And the McKinney neighborhood is bounded by the red box. This is a carbon copy of the Department of Interior, General Land Office, Washington, D.C., April 12, 1900 announcement titled Colville Indian Lands Open to Settlement with Instructions for the Application Process. This was the notification that allowed all the homesteaders in the Methow Valley to file for the application process. The Homestead Act was passed in the middle of the Civil War, and it promoted the settlement of the western United States. Initially, it was designed as a form of payment for Civil War veterans who fought on either side, but later it was open to other men and women. In the McKinney area, most of the homesteaders were veterans or miners. Prior to 1895, early settlers staked out a claim with others as witness to the measurement and a document, then squatted on the land building a cabin and farming. Once the area was surveyed, they could adjust their property boundaries to fit the surveyed sections and apply to the local Waterville, Washington land office. Because this presentation includes a lot of maps as part of its explanation and story, I want to give a brief cartography overview. The U.S. Public Land Survey is a grid system using township, range, and section mapping. A township measures the distance north or south from a designated parallel and is 6 miles in length. The range measures east or west from a principal meridian and is 6 miles long also. Within a township and a range, there are 36 sections. Each section is 1 square mile containing 640 acres, and this is divided into 4 quarters of 160 acres, which is also the maximum number of acres for a homestead claim. And these maps show you the township grid, the township and range grid, and then the section being divided up into the 4 quarters. This is a 1934 Metzger map, all of the mapping of the Okanogan County, but just the area for the McKinney neighborhood. This is for Township 35N, which is north of the 35th parallel, Range 20, east of the Willamette Meridian, or EWM, and includes the sections 16, 15, 10, and 9, and this is bounded by the red circle. This is a map of the same area as you saw in the Metzger 1934 map, only this is Okanogan County's 2019 map of the McKinney neighborhood. And it is produced by Okanogan County Assessor's Office. The yellow lines are property boundaries and the blue lines are section boundaries. Using maps from the first survey, which was 1895, a next survey in 1910 by land office companies, of another federal survey in 1919, then Metzger maps for 1934 and 1959, and finally the County Assessor's Office 2019 maps, you can see the progression of ownership and subdivision of land. The Schaefer Museum has these maps in its collection. The Bureau of Land Management's General Land Office was responsible for recording all the homestead claims and giving people their property or their patent afterward. And it's a great website to learn more about homesteaders and where their property was located. And I use this extensively in this presentation in order to see who were the original owners and how far were their original homesteads subdivided to come up to the present. In order to obtain the free land, the homesteader had to improve property by building a dwelling and cultivating or attempting to cultivate the land and not sell it in less than 5 years. Homestead claims that had proved up, which means met the 3 requirements that I just stated, were sent a letter and a certificate. Patents, homestead patents, are an exclusive land grant made by the U.S. President for a specific tract of government land and includes the U.S. seal and the President's signature. This is a sample of a patent certificate. It's signed by President William McKinney in 1924, and it's not from the McKinney neighborhood, but it is from the Methow Valley in an area just south of Winthrop. From 1880 to 1920, the early settlement period, the McKinney area was a harsh environment for the first settlers. Many weren't prepared for winter. The winter of 1889-1890 was hard, with snow over 7 feet on the ground. Livestock died because they couldn't scrape off the snow to the ground in order to reach the grass. Horses ate tails and manes off other horses, and they even ate tree branches. In 1892, there was a severe blizzard that put settlers in their homes for days. Guy Waring's stepdaughter, Anna Greene, writes and describes this period.
The blizzard of 1892 in the Methow Valley is one never to be forgotten by those who were there and had to live through it. The whole winter was one of the worst the area had ever known. Temperatures went down to 36 degrees below zero and stayed there for days at a time. With snow falling hard, I set out on horseback on one of my daily chores, which was to ride 3 miles down to the valley to Bear Creek to pick up a can of milk. It was bitter cold, and I was wrapped in a blanket on my saddle. I had to swing my arms to keep up my circulation. On the way home, the milk froze and popped the top off the can. The wind came up, and it blew harder and harder all the time. The snow was so thick I was completely blinded. I doubt if you have ever seen that kind of snow. It was so thick you couldn't see the person right beside you on horseback. The governor became concerned for my safety and set out to meet me, fearing I might get lost. My singing was all that made it possible for him to find me in the world of solid swirling white. Luckily, the horses knew the way in spite of the snow, and followed the road home. But for this, we might have been utterly lost.
McKinney area was named for John McKinney, and 20 years after he died, his diary from 1892, when he arrived here from the Midwest, was found, and it talks about how harsh the first winter was for him too. His diary notes in July 6th that there was frost at Hancox, and Hancox was his neighbor, his adjacent neighbor. On July 7th, he notes that potatoes and beans were killed in his own garden. So this shows you how difficult the weather could be in the Methow Valley at that period. The first settlers lived in log cabins with dirt floors, sometimes covered with deerskins. The fire for heater cooking was not always in a chimney, so the house was drafty. Settlers cleared the land of trees and shrubs, created roads, plowed land with teams of horses, and planted the first crops. Some raised cattle. Everyone had a garden because the nearest store was in Winthrop at Guy Waring's Methow Valley Trading Company. Mazama was just a collection of cabins. Because of the homestead requirement to cultivate the land, the men became subsistence farmers. Ambitious growers started out with cattle, horses, and other farm animals, but the deep snows scaled back many dreams to reality. Everyone was growing hay. The equipment varied from farm to farm, and neighbors shared machinery and teams of horses. Roads were built by these pioneers as they worked on their homes and land. The first road to the area was what is now Wolf Creek Road, although the part through the Forest Service section was just an Indian trail. Homesteaders went together and hooked 2 to 3 teams up and then hitched a sort of sled made of 2 large flat-bottom logs to create roads, sort of like a skid. Later, it was quite an improvement in road clearing when 3 stout horse teams were hitched to a big, heavy V-shaped plow, which you see demonstrated here in this picture during the wintertime. Mining was also happening in the McKinney area. There were 8 mining claims on McKinney Mountain, starting at the base and up the rock face of Lucky Jim Bluff. Their names were Tip Top, Round Top, St. Charles, Lucky Jim, Cliff Lode, Columbia, Homestake, and Hawthorne. Some McKinney homesteaders worked on these claims, which were consolidated in the 1920s by the Methow Gold and Copper Mining Company. These mines were in Section 16, Township 35, Range 20, as seen on this map. Local pioneers also built ditches. The first was built by Chester Briggs and John McKinney, a 3-mile ditch tapping Boulder Creek. It went through the trees along the edge of the valley floor, and it's the blue line on the image to the right, running from the upper left to the lower right. The second ditch was built in the early 1900s and was called the Ramm Hancox ditch for Julius Ramm and Hamilton Hancox, who were pioneers in this area. It drew its water from the Methow River and its sloughs and was lower in the valley, and it's a red line above the McKinney ditch line. Both of these ditches irrigated the McKinney area. This is a map from Doug Devon's Mazama the past 125 years, and it shows the Methow River, which is the multi-line squiggly vertical river going up and down. The dark heavy line is the current Highway 20. It also shows local roads, pioneer properties in dotted lines, and existing lost pioneer cabins home. The McKinney neighborhood boundaries are roughly within the red box. This table shows the 13 homesteaders, including John McKinney, who actually didn't get a patent, what section of land they were in, how many acres they got, and when did they receive their patent. The stories of these homesteaders, as well as McKinney, who died before the first patents were being awarded, come from the museum's photos, documents, family stories, and collections and reference books, and Okanagan County Historical Society heritage publications. Ancestry.com was used to find these people in U.S. Census records from 1880 through 1940, because for many of them, there is no story other than the survey plat maps and the BLM's General Land Office homesteader records. The museum has good records for John McKinney, George Fender, and Lester Hollaway. It has some records for the other 8 homesteaders. I found no records for John Clayton and Frank Lang except in a 1914 Polk directory. John McKinney homesteaded 80 acres in Section 15. His claim is likely the small square marked FC, meaning final claim, with the arrow pointing to it. He was a Civil War veteran and a bachelor who left Kansas in 1892, heading Washington to find land. His trade was a leather worker or cobbler, and he made willow and rawhide chairs for his neighbors and repaired or made their shoes. The remnants of McKinney's cabin are next to the Barron and Hancox Springs in the McKinney area. These are pictures from 2000 and 2019, and they show the deterioration of his second cabin that he built. McKinney's 1892 diary was found in his cabin 20 years after his death by Frank Cum, who had bought the property in 1924 from the Briggs family, and the Briggs had likely acquired it after McKinney's death. The diary chronicles his first year in concise entries and weather observations. He's a man of few written words, but they do reveal how industrious and singular he was. In April, he found land north of Hamilton, Hancox, between what is now Wolf Creek Road and Cum Road, a parcel that he walked off with Hancox as witness and waited until 1895 to file his claim. His property contained ponds, beaver dams, timber, and good flat land. He immediately started in on a garden, brush clearing, a wagon road, and built and roofed a crude cabin with a door, a window, and a bunk. His diary notes, "Move into my cabin, go to bed in my own home." His garden included peanuts and artichokes. The museum has digitized this calendar booklet. After his initial flurry of property development, he went looking for work. He walked to Loomis, where a new mine was under construction. He walked to Loomis in 2 days, which now takes 23 hours to walk on Forest Service roads. Throughout 1892, he sought carpenter work near mines and in Concanoli after blocks of the town had burned. He worked feverishly from October 1 to mid-December, finishing a larger cabin while the weather turned to winter and routine snow. In early November, he worked on the body of the house and the roof. First snowfall was November 7. In the second half of November, he worked on the chimney, gables, and door and window jambs. It snowed 10 of the last 15 days of November. In December, he installed the door, windows, built the chimney taller, chinked the wood and plastered, and made a workbench, a bunk, and a mantel for the fireplace. On December 18th, he started work on shoe repair for the neighbors, so he was finally settled in. Hamilton Hancox homesteaded 160 acres in Section 16. When McKinney arrived in 1892, Hancox had already claimed and squatted on land between current Wool Creek Road and Cum Road. From census records, he was born in 1829 in Pennsylvania and a bachelor farmer in Hot Springs, California, in mining country in the 1870s. At the age of 53, he married twice widowed Sarah Cantrell Beebe Dalton, who had 3 young daughters from her last marriage. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born soon afterward, and by 1892, the extended family had moved to the McKinney area. Sarah died a year after their arrival. Daughter Elizabeth married neighbor Clarence Perrine in 1892, and Hamilton lived alone on his homestead until the end of his life, when he moved in with his daughter and her family, and he died in 1920. He's buried in the Sullivan Cemetery in Winthrop. Perrines: Albert, the father; Clarence and Marvin, the sons. Albert Perrine homesteaded 160 acres in Section 15. He was born in New York in 1847 and a Civil War veteran. Albert and his sons, Clarence Burdett Perrine and Marvin Wells Perrine, all lived in the McKinney area at one time. Prior to arriving in the McKinney area, Albert was a farmer, but he was also a miner and later a farmer here. Albert likely arrived in Okanong County on or before 1870 because his last son, Marvin, was born that year in this county. This is an example of a patent notification letter that you can find in the General Land Office's website. This is for Albert Perrine's homestead application, and it's signed by Woodrow Wilson in 1914. Albert's older son, Clarence Burdett, was born in 1868 in Michigan. Clarence's claim is north of the McKinney area in Section 3 and has an arrow pointing to it. He married Elizabeth Hancock, the neighbor's daughter. Clarence and Marvin worked at the Columbia Mine on Lucky Jim Bluff. Clarence and Elizabeth had 2 sons, Clarence and Albert. He and Elizabeth lived the rest of their lives in the McKinney area, and both died in 1950 and were buried in the Sullivan Cemetery. Their son Clarence lived his life on the family farm, and Albert moved to Western Washington. Marvin Wells Perrine was born in 1870 in Okanung County. He was a miner, and the fallen down cabin at the far end of the McKinney neighborhood, up against the hillside and in the trees, is Marvin's. He staked the claim for the Lucky Jim mine. He also had a patent in Section 3, indicated by the arrow on the previous slide. He was a miner or a farmer throughout his life and married in 1901 and settled down in Longview, Washington, where he died in 1936. Julius Ramm homesteaded 120 acres in Section 15. Julius Caesar Ramm was born in 1876 in Camptonville, California, a mining area in the Sierra Nevadas. His parents were German farmers with 7 children. This line drawing of Julius's parents is from the California Gold Rush Community Collection. Julius married in California and had 2 children, Luke Laverne and Virginia Lucille. They came to the McKinney area around 1901. Julius worked as a miner, farmer, and in 1930 as a Shell oil laborer, living in Twist. Julius and his wife lived separately sometime after 1940, and he died in 1952 in Nevada. Julius's son Luke worked as a miner and road worker out of Twisp before moving to Camptonville, California as a miner in 1940. He died in 1972 in Nevada. Julius's daughter Virginia was born in the McKinney area and grew up in Twisp, where she was a school teacher. She moved to California in 1940 to join her mother, and she died there in 1997. While she was living in Twisp, she owned a gold mine, which was likely her father's, and her friends used to give her the nickname Virginia Ramm Gold Mine. Chester Briggs homesteaded 120 acres in Section 15. The small square marked FC is likely the McKinney claim that Chester or his son Harry Briggs acquired after McKinney's death. Chester Briggs was the father of Charles E. and Harry Clark Briggs. Chester was born in Indiana in 1829, married, and had 5 children. He arrived in the McKinney area on or before 1892 when he built the ditch with McKinney to irrigate their fields. There's very little information about this man in museum files, census records, or genealogy records. Son Charles E. Briggs was born in 1865 in Iowa and came to the McKinney area with his father and his brother Harry in the 1890s. Charles and Harry mined in the Harts Pass area and also on McKinney Mountain. But in June 1906, Charles shot himself. The Methow Valley News article reads, "Takes his own life, sad death of a well-to-do McKinney Mountain pioneer." Charles E. Briggs, a well-to-do rancher of the upper Methow Valley and a pioneer, suicided Tuesday afternoon at Winthrop. Mr. Briggs came to town in the morning from his ranch on McKinney Mountain and that day had closed a real estate deal in the sum of $12,000, receiving the money in full. A short time afterwards, he went with his father to a saloon and, leaving his father in the barroom, went to an outbuilding in the rear. A pistol shot within a few seconds after his leaving the room caused an investigation, which resulted in finding Briggs with a bullet hole just above the left ear and a smoking revolver at his feet. He lived about an hour, not regaining consciousness. No cause can be ascribed by his father or friends for the awful deed. He was in easy circumstances financially, in apparent good health, and was well known and liked throughout the valley. Deceased was about 38 years of age. Son Harry Clark Briggs was born in 1863 in Iowa. Initially, he had a cabin on McKinney's claim. Harry worked as a miner and carried the first mail to the Harts Pass mines. In 1915, Harry married Florence Olivia Lawrence Johnson, who was divorced from a neighbor of Harry's, and that must have caused quite a stir in the community. Harry and wife Florence and her daughter Gertrude lived initially in the Mazama area, but then the family moved to Idaho, and Harry lived the rest of his life there. Florence and Gertrude returned to the Methow Valley after Harry's death, and Florence is buried in the Beaver Creek Cemetery in Twisp. Gertrude married and continued to farm Harry Briggs' property in the McKinney area. George Fender filed on 40 acres of land on the east side of the Methow River, just south of where the current Weeman Bridge is. His parents, Link and Effie Fender, settled in Texas Creek near Carlton in 1889 when George was 2. The Fender family story describes their wagon crossing from Pateros over the ridge on an old road called Hogsback. The text is, "Then they went up and over. Instead of coming down by our place where they eventually built the switchback road they called the Hogsback, they came down about halfway where our schoolhouse eventually was built below our place. They had a log tied behind the wagon. The branches were cut so they were pushing into the ground so they couldn't slide anymore because this is a regular rock cliff. Every so often they would throw a rope or chain around a tree, so if the wagon would get away, this would slow it down and catch them. This cut bands until the trees had circles around them where this rope made marks. I could go up there now and find it if they hadn't cut the trees down or it fell with age." George was the oldest brother and responsible for building a house to replace his parents' first log cabin, which was becoming too small for a family of 8 children. He left home at 15 to work in logging at the mining camps in Slate Creek. There he got a job as an off-bearer, a person who takes away slabs and lumber as they fall from the saw and places them in piles. George got his gloved hand caught in the saw and cut off his fingers. The doctor tried to sew them back on, but pieces of the glove were left in the torn wound and it got infected. Blood poisoning set in, but he eventually recovered. He started in the lumber business and ended up owning at least 2 mills. The first mill was in Mazama before the current Weeman Bridge, meaning just on the Winthrop side. The second mill was in Twisp and called the Wetzel and Fender Mill. The Fender mills went broke in 1936, and the mill in Mazama was dismantled in 1940. George married Frida Ortel in 1917, and Frida was another Methow Valley pioneer from the Bear Creek area. They settled initially in the Mazama area where he had his first mill, and then they moved to Winthrop and had a grocery store in town. Their daughter, Roberta Fender, was born in 1922 in the Rockview area, which is near where the Weeman Bridge is. George died in 1934 from cancer at the age of 47, and Frida died in 1981, and both are buried in the Sullivan Cemetery. Roberta married and moved to Pennsylvania and died there in 1987. Lester homesteaded 124 acres in Section 16, an area that was not included in the 1895 survey, but was added by the federal government into land for private ownership in 1919. Hollaway's family story is one of the best accounts of early pioneer life that the museum has in its collections. Lester was born in 1887 in Nebraska and moved to Spokane to join his sister Orpha and her husband Ed Ellen, and there married Ethel Callahan. They moved to the McKinney area in 1908 along with Ethel's sister Olive and her husband Bill Looney at the urging and financial support of Ethel and Olive's father, Vess Callahan, who was interested in mining. For the young couples, camping near Copper Mountain, which is behind Edelweiss, in the North Cascades was an adventure. Ethel Hollaway writes in her family story, "We drove with a horse team and hack on to Copper Mountain. What a beauty all the way. The high mountains hemming us in, the beautiful yellow pines and fir trees, tall mountains everywhere, and that beautiful carved bluff that we could see, which, we were told later, was called Gold Wall. We went in pine grass so thick and above our knees. We were so happy that we all just hopped off our hack and rolled in the pretty grass. We turned our horses loose, and the first thing they did was to have a good roll in the grass, too. But they sniffed that grass and did not like it. Not many other kinds, though, so they did learn to like it. We easily found the little mine. It was such a pretty place to camp, and in no time we had camp established. Olive and I made several trips down into the valley while the men worked." After the mining work was finished, Lester and Ethel moved into the abandoned Clayton cabin at the edge of the McKinney area. Lester then claimed an HES, Homesteader Entry Survey, on a Forest Service section that had just opened to homesteaders. In 1911, Lester built a large barn and sheds for 12 cows and calves. The Weemans moved across the Methow River from them and were their closest neighbor. Ethel writes, "We cut small trees out so we could signal each other by hanging a large sheet high outside, which meant let's get together." Ethel taught at McKinney School for 2 years, and the photo here is an early dinner celebration for the children. Ethel's in the back at the left. In the winter, Lester cleared a snow-covered trail by dragging a log behind his horse so that his wife could ride her pony to school less than a mile away. The children arrived on horses and in sleds. At this time, Lester went to his first road meeting. Even at that early period, settlers realized the value and potential of a northern route to western Washington. Later in life, he was instrumental in getting the North Cascades Highway built and opened in 1972. Ethel writes that their neighbors were Harry Briggs, the Perrines, George and Mary Linsmeyer, and John Clayton, all original homesteaders. Sister Olive and her husband Bill Looney lived close by in the Mazama area. Frank came in 1924, and a number of Holloways and Callahans lived out their life in the Methow Valley. Ethel and Lester's grandson, Chuck McCallum, made a timely visit to the museum just as we were preparing the McKinney presentation, and many of his photos from this family are in this pioneer section. Harry Weeman homesteaded 80 acres in Section 10, the land on either side of the current Weeman Bridge. Harry Alton Weeman was born in Maine in 1869. He moved to Colorado for mining work, and there he met his wife Nellie, with whom he had 3 children. In 1911, the family moved to the McKinney area, where he was a farmer. Nellie died in 1934 in Seattle, and Harry died in Wenatchee in 1950. The first river crossing over the Methow River in the McKinney area was on the Weeman property, and it was a cage suspended on a steel cable. The first wood bridge was built in 1913, but a flood took it out the next year. Then a steel bridge was built. Then a better steel bridge was built in 1945. Now the Weeman Bridge is a concrete structure built during the North Cascades Highway project construction. Development of the McKinney Mountain area from the 1920s to the present progressed slowly, largely due to the remoteness of the Methow Valley, the 1920s, 1930s recession, and then World War II. After the homesteaders received their patents, many sold their land if it was marginally productive. Cash was hard to come by until the early 1940s, and many large farms were not subdivided or short-platted until after the 1950s. The opening of the North Cascades Highway, Highway 20, also started the Methow Valley's largest settlement phase. Many farms had been subdivided, but farming continues to define the look, if not the income, of our valley.